Hello and welcome to the final session of today's instalment of Interact Virtual. With her talk, Designing for Behaviour Change in UX. What's it all about and why should we do it? In this talk, Rebecca will introduce a well-established behaviour change framework and discuss how weaving this into a project at the right points can help us design experiences and products which will be implemented and adopted with success. If you've got any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. And I'll try to ask Rebecca as many as I can at the end. Please say hello to each other in the chat and do let us know if there's any issues with audio or anything like that, and we'll do our best to get that fixed ASAP. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Rebecca to begin.
Cool, thanks Henry, and thank you for coming along this afternoon to listen to my talk. So hi, I'm Rebecca. I am a user experience consultant at Mensa. And so my background is in psychology. So I worked in academic research for a long time before joining the world of UX. But I've always been really interested in learning about and understanding human behavior. So my PhD was about developing predictive behavioral markers. So designing ways to measure kind of subtle behavioral differences really early in life in people at increased risk of developing dementia later on. So behaviour has always been something that's been just kind of really central to my work. So I acknowledge that a lot of work I do as a UX consultant is actually about behaviour change. So whether that's immediately obvious from a brief or not. And today I wanted to share with you a bit of a kind of behaviour change in UX 101 really, to help you consider a slightly more formal behaviour change lens for the work that we already do. And hopefully I'll also show you today that this approach can be both kind of time and cost effective and lead to increased success in the kind of products, services and experiences that we design. Oh, sorry, just making sure I can skip slides. Okay, so have a look at these images on the screen. So are any of these kind of, I guess, behaviours or behaviour changes things that you have experienced maybe recently? So changes that you've tried to make to your own behaviour. So have you tried, for example, to get more exercise? Perhaps during the start of lockdown, you maybe started running or doing some kind of more home exercises. Drinking less alcohol, perhaps, maybe not at the beginning of lockdown, but maybe this is something we're all thinking a bit more about now. Or what about trying to save money? That's another one. It's quite relevant to everybody. And also something that's really relevant to everybody, particularly more recently, is wearing a mask. So this is something we've all had to kind of start doing as part of our everyday lives. And I know that, you know, I never, well, I very rarely leave my house without my house keys, but more often than not, I think I get to the end of my street and I realise that I've forgotten to pack my mask. So what I'm kind of suggesting really is, or saying is that behaviours actually are quite complex, but also quite difficult to change. So that's whether we're changing our own behaviours or those of others. And essentially, this is the job that behaviour change designers have. So just backtracking a little bit. So what is behaviour change? Well, you've probably at least heard of it, which is why you're here today. But for a while now, academics have been doing some pretty extensive research to understand human behaviour. And there are many reasons why understanding human behaviour is both interesting and useful. So firstly, as intelligent beings, we are super interested in understanding as much about ourselves as possible, including what makes us tick. But also there are many kind of undesirable behaviours which exist, such as dangerous or unhealthy behaviours that we might want to change to help us live kind of longer, happier, healthier lives. And in fact, behaviour change research actually started in health behaviour exclusively, and it's kind of evolved out and away of that more recently into many industries. But essentially, it's all about applying principles of psychology to understand why we behave the way we do and what we need to do if we want to change how people behave. So what behaviour change research has given us is theories and frameworks to understand behaviour, and evidence to understand what works to change a behaviour, and this is called an intervention. And this is really important because understanding what drives the behaviour allows us to design a targeted intervention to change it. And this is behaviour change design. So back to those examples of behaviour change that I took you through earlier. So some products, services, or experiences are intended to change people's behaviours in the real world. These are, as I said, interventions. And really importantly, behaviour change design is typically focused on helping people to achieve their goals. But that being said, behaviour change design is about business. So largely, often. So most products include business goals that live alongside the kind of user behaviour change goals. So for example, products may carry subscription fees, require users to pay access to premium features, or urge them to kind of purchase expensive connected devices, for example, for enhanced functionality. I can probably think of a few examples for that one. But yeah, so behaviour change is most effective when both parties or all parties have goals to achieve or something to gain, not just when it's maybe just the user or just the business. So for example, from these examples on the screen, Runkeeper becomes a profitable business when people want to jump into the paid account. And they usually want to do this because it's really helping them to take more exercise, to run more. So they see a benefit to them and they're willing to pay for that. Who benefits from us drinking less alcohol? Well, obviously we do, and also so do the NHS. So when less people need to be treated for alcohol-related problems, obviously that alleviates financial burden. And banks supporting us to work towards achieving savings goals. Well, you know, we get support with reaching our savings goals, and the banks get to keep our money within their banks. So really importantly as well for the context of this talk, so in addition to these goals or these things that people want to achieve, to change behaviour, people must have the ability to perform the behaviour we want to change. So even if they have the goal in mind, if they don't have the ability, they're not going to be able to do the behaviour. It's going to be a behaviour blocker. And I'll come back to this a bit later. So those were all examples of behaviour change interventions which already exist in the world and have been really successful. But actually, as I said before, much of the work we do in UX is actually about behaviour change in some way. However, when a brief lands with us, we may not always think about this with a behaviour change lens. And this is basically what I want to draw your attention to today, is that perhaps actually we should. So take a look at these examples. These are really classic examples of the sorts of briefs that we get in UX, where services, so I'm going to focus a bit more on kind of services for that purpose of today, but where services have been built which solve user problems. So, you know, research has been done up front to make sure there is a user need for this service. But actually the service just isn't not as many users are engaging with the service as would be kind of predicted or hoped. And yeah, so cool. So yeah, so we should think about the fact that if we want somebody to engage with a product and get the most out of it, our job may not just be actually about making sure that the experience is good for the user, but actually we might need to think about the behaviours of our users and what might either enable or be a barrier to the behaviour that we want to see. And by finding out what these barriers are, we can design solutions into the service which overcome any barriers to use. So these are examples of really classic examples of services that have been built with problems that actually are about changing behaviours. So public transport service, for example, so where people just aren't using the service. We might think that improving the experience of the service might solve this problem. But actually, again, what we might be failing to consider is that something else might be going on. There might be other behavioural barriers to users using the service. Or take chatbot, for example. So this is another really common one. So chatbots are used to help users get the answers to usually pretty simple questions that they can get the answers quickly rather than having to wait in, you know, kind of call center phone queues. And also that's kind of clogging up the call center for people who might actually need to actually speak to somebody because they have a more complex problem. So even though there's a really clear user need for a chatbot, for example, it's not always the case that people actually use the chatbot. And finally, so this is a slightly different example, design and build a tool to improve medical provisions. Now, so this is an example of when a client will come to us and say, you know, help us design and build this service. And I think, well, essentially the point I'm trying to make here is the first two of these examples are where the service already exists. There was a clear user need identified, but actually people just aren't engaging with the service in the way that was predicted. We're kind of hypothesizing that this might be about behavior barriers. But actually designing and building a tool is actually, you know, in advance of the service being already established and that problem being kind of surfaced. So what I'm suggesting is actually that this kind of approaching these problems with a kind of behavior change lens might actually allow us to think about the potential barriers that might pop up or crop up actually within that service once it's designed. And let's try and almost kind of, you know, work those out in advance, and then we can kind of design solutions as part of the service that we're designing and building. Okay, so where do we start with behavior change design? So brief lands with you, you've realized that the key thing here is that you need to change behavior. Because behavior change research, behavior change research, we know that all this stuff works. There are loads of theories and models, we know they work, and we also know why they work to help change behavior. And so if we want to change behavior in our work, it makes sense that we turn to these established frameworks to structure our thinking and for evidence of what types of interventions we should use. I mean, why would you not use something that's, you know, tried and tested and really well established? But the problem is there's such a vast sea of theories, models and literature out there. So how do you know where to go and where to start to find the right model or framework when there are so many to choose from? And that's kind of what I want to help you out with a bit today. So I'm going to introduce you to a framework that I found to be quite useful and successful. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a bit of a behavior change kind of framework application 101. So I should say this is a framework which is focused on understanding and overcoming blockers of an ability to perform behaviors, and finding and designing the right solution to help remove that blocker and enable the behavior. Although there are other approaches to behavior change design, and I'm not saying this is the only one or it's best under all circumstances, but it's definitely a framework that I would recommend and find really helpful for thinking about the problem. So before I introduce you to that, so you might be thinking, what about nudge? So in case you haven't heard of nudge, nudges are essentially kind of prompts that can promote or prevent certain behaviours in the moment almost. But nudge is best used as a kind of component of an intervention. So to be most effective, we still need to understand what's driving existing behaviours to design intervention which is most likely or will be most kind of successful in changing it. So nudge is great, it's brilliant, we can use it as part of interventions, but it's not something we should just jump into standalone. It's definitely something that we need to kind of factor in as a solution once we've kind of found out you know, what the kind of target behaviour is and how we're going to go about intervening. Okay, so again, just before I actually go into the framework, so phases and stages of design. So the behavior design process is described in many different ways by many different people, and you kind of, I think after you've sort of done this a few times, you get a feel of how you think it's best to work, and you can adapt it to for different kind of projects. But essentially there are these kind of really key kind of stages or phases of the behavior design process. And Amy Bucher, in her recent book called Engaged, which was published this year, which is absolutely brilliant, and I definitely recommend reading it if you're interested in behavior change design. It's really well written, and it's kind of one of those books that you almost don't want to put down. It's really, really cool. But this is how she describes how she works in behavior change design. So essentially, she kind of starts with this kind of research and discovery phase to understand the problem space. You know, really understanding the users, understanding behaviours that we might want to change, you know, and kind of just getting a better understanding of those sort of target behaviours. This then moves through into a kind of generative phase where potential solutions can be explored. And actually lots of solutions potential solutions might come up. So at this stage, there's also a bit of kind of prioritization that might take place. And then that leads into kind of creating or building the product or website or process or service, just getting it out into the world, leading into evaluation where we measure the kind of success or the effectiveness of the behavior intervention. So you might also notice that the labels of these are quite kind of like healthcare related, and that's just because, you know, as I said earlier, health behavior change was really kind of born with this focus around behavior change design was really born with this focus around health behavior change. So lots of the kind of terminology is sometimes still a little bit quite health specific. Cool, so don't worry too much about the labels, just it's really important that you understand that there are these phases that we move through. So you might recognize or be a bit more familiar with this process model, the double diamond. So in this process, similarly, we always start with defining the problem. We then go and do our research to discover and understand that problem space a bit better, understand our users, understand, you know, what's going on, what what kind of pain points there are in a service, you know, what works well. So we go out into this huge kind of venture of discovery, and then what we start doing is then kind of trying to kind of define what the solution might look like later. So kind of narrowing down all of those kind of insights that we have into what's most relevant to take forward. We then go into this development phase where we kind of ideate and we think about all the kind of possible solutions, and then we narrow back down again to a kind of the best solution to take forward to deliver to solve our problem. And as you can see, the behavior change design fits really nicely onto the kind of our UX kind of design process. I think that's something just to bear in mind. So it's all kind of, you know, moving through the kind of same phases and stages. Okay, so you may have seen this before. So you may have come across it somewhere or perhaps thought about using it yourself. So I've just got a little notification on the screen, okay. Yeah, so you may have seen this before, come across it somewhere, maybe you've thought about using it before. So it's called the behavior change wheel, and this hinges on a behavior system called the COMBI model. And this is a framework for understanding and designing interventions to change behavior. So essentially identifying blockers to our ability to perform a behavior, and then finding the best solutions to overcome these blockers. So the behavior change wheel was developed by a really brilliant group at UCL. And really importantly for us, this established framework is based on many existing theories and frameworks. So it's derived from all of these existing theories and frameworks I mentioned earlier in the literature. So this is great news for us because essentially it means that we don't have to spend loads of time searching through loads of theories and literature. This really should offer us, you know, what we need to do the job. And the way the wheel is used is that in the center of the wheel, so the little green bit in the middle, we have this kind of COMBI model. It's the behavior system. And this really just involves three essential conditions for behavior. So capability, opportunity, and motivation. And then around that we have in the kind of red inner circle of the wheel, functions which address these behavioral conditions. So specifically when the conditions involve a blocker, and a blocker on our ability to perform a behavior, these are the interventions that are suggested that we use. So when you've identified what's blocking the ability to perform a behavior, you can use the wheel to help pick the right intervention or solution to overcome that barrier. Actually, and although this is presented like a wheel, don't let that confuse you too much. You can actually think of it as more of a decision tree, but I will show you that later. The grey circle around the outside is 7 categories of policy that could enable those interventions to occur, but actually that's not something that I've ever used, and yeah, so I'm just going to park that one for today, but maybe if you're interested in that and it's relevant to you, you can go and do a little bit more reading. Okay, so where do we start? So the point of behaviour change design is to facilitate the performance of target behaviours. So every behaviour change intervention has one or more target behaviours. Target behaviour is a specific behaviour that designers are trying to affect. So whether they want people to do something more, do something less, or just do it differently than how they're doing it already. And this might sound really, really obvious, but the first thing we need to do is define the behaviour that we want to target to change. And this is so important. So the better define the behaviour, the easier it will be for you. So anybody who has ever done any research will probably understand that how difficult it is to do research if you have a poorly defined research question. So if you start with something vague, everything's going to be vague the whole way through. It's just really important to make sure that what you're actually trying to find out is really, really clearly defined, and that will shape everything you do after that. Okay, so, and also one other thing, so particularly in UX, so this kind of process of defining the target behavior, this would actually be a kind of good time to really involve, so if you're working with a client, for example, the client's objectives, and just to make sure that you're kind of aligned with what they want the product or service to be, so that we are definitely targeting a behavior that we are aligned on and we understand. So also checking what's in scope, that's a good time to have that kind of conversation. Okay, so thinking again about this kind of defining the target behavior. So I've got a kind of a bad example and a good example here just to illustrate. Customers, this is an example of a problem that I showed you earlier. So customers with simple to solve problems are not using our new chatbot. They're still calling the call center. So an example of a kind of really unhelpful definition of a target behavior or a behavior that we're looking to change is get people to use the chatbot. So what does that mean? That's so vague. Does it mean everybody? I guess so. Using the chatbot, yeah, it just doesn't really help us to start thinking about, the kind of questions that we would, sorry, one second. Sorry, alarm going off in my fridge. Okay, yeah, so a better definition for our problem or target behavior is, so increase the number of customers with simple to solve problems. So that's who our customers are, using the chatbot to resolve their questions and queries, what we want them to do, rather than calling the call center. So you can see already just kind of framing that in that way and being much more kind of specific will really help us when we're kind of, trying to think about our research approach, the kind of questions that we're going to ask people, and actually what we want to find out. But also actually that will help us in kind of establishing how we're going to measure the kind of effectiveness of our behaviour change intervention. Okay, so back to the convening model that I briefly touched on earlier. So the convening model is this behaviour system which is at that very centre of the behaviour wheel. So the bit in green. And as I mentioned previously, the model says that in order for a behaviour to occur, people must have enough capability, opportunity, and motivation to perform it. So basically, a major factor in whether somebody will or will not perform a behaviour is, even if they have a goal in place, is whether they can, so their ability. And this may seem really obvious, so much so that it maybe doesn't need to be said, but actually designers forget this all the time. So many times when a product that's supposed to help people change behaviour fails, it's because the designers didn't understand and address the reasons why that particular behaviour can be difficult or even impossible. But once you know what stops people from doing the desired behaviour, you can design to overcome those barriers. Cool. So as you can see here as well, and I'll move on to this next, but those different, so actually, well, it's probably quite useful to point out as well. So the capability, motivation, opportunity kind of conditions. Lots of people call these really different things, but for the sake of today, we're going to call them ability blockers. So as you can see, they've got these different subcomponents, which I'll quickly run through now. If my slide changes, okay. So capability. So capability can be is broken down into two kind of subcomponents, and those are physical capability and psychological capability. So physical capability is about having the necessary kind of physical strength and skills to perform a behaviour. So for example, not being able to run a short distance to begin to get fit. So if you think about lots of apps, for example, that might ask you to get fit, run 5K. And actually, if you can't run 1 kilometre, which I might be guilty of, how on earth are you going to reach those goals? So something like Couch to 5K is a really nice intervention which is designed to overcome that problem. Psychological capability, so having the necessary knowledge to perform a behaviour, understanding how to do it, or having the mental skill or capacity to carry it out. So that's really just about, yeah, I guess just having the knowledge, but also psychological and emotional capacity to make decisions about your behaviour is also a really important one. So for example, if you don't know how to set up and use a GP video consultation app, that's kind of about the knowledge and understanding. But actually, you might find yourself in a situation where you need to speak to a GP and you've got a medical problem and you're feeling, quite worried, quite anxious, quite upset, and actually you just don't have the capacity kind of psychologically to be contending with trying to set up this app for the first time when actually you're quite distressed about your health and you're, just not you can't really focus on all of these things at once. So motivation. So motivation again is split into two kind of subcomponents. We've got automatic motivation, which are kind of automatic processes, kind of reflex responses, habits that develop over time, that kind of much more, kind of automatic kind of response kind of drivers. So for example, drinking fizzy drinks because they taste nice and or out of habit. Reflective motivation, so reflective, conscious kind of considerations, particularly kind of weighing up the pros and cons of a kind of behaviour that you may or may not engage in. Goals and values which drive you towards or away from a behaviour. So this actually is a good example for the chatbot example I gave earlier. So using the chatbot may be quicker than calling, but I might not get the answer I need, so ultimately it will take longer. So that's kind of being reflective and weighing up the pros and cons of using the chatbot. Okay, and opportunity. So opportunity is broken up into subcomponents of physical and social opportunity. So environmental factors which may promote or prevent a behaviour. So this includes having the tools or materials or resources, and something that I think is a really nice one is actually a resource being time in the environment to perform a behaviour. So for example, there are no public plastic recycling bins on my walking routes. So, that makes plastic recycling in public really difficult. And for some people, they would just too much to go and put their recycling, their plastic into a normal bin. Social opportunity. So social factors which influence behaviour, so peer support, observing others around you, social norms play a massive role in this. So an example is that when I meet my friends, if they're drinking alcohol, I would find it really difficult not to. Okay, so how do we go about finding out about these kind of ability blockers? So we do what we do really well in UX, we go and do our research. So we go out into the world and we talk to people who use these products and these services, and we set out to understand them. So to understand the behaviours, particularly the behaviour ability blockers. So essentially this is the discovery phase, that kind of first phase of the double diamond, or the kind of discovery phase that I talked about in that kind of 4-stage process that Amy Booker wrote about. So we do research with the people we are designing for and with, and these kinds of research methods, as you will be very familiar with, include, so we could go and do a bit of reading around the topic. We can get out and we can do kind of guerrilla research. We can do user testing, user interviews. We can create kind of service diaries where we can ask people to give us kind of feedback in the moment whilst they're actually interacting with the service about what kind of behavioural blockers they might be experiencing. And one thing I'm a massive advocate of is contextual research, and I think actually observational research can be really, really powerful. So often when we find that people may not actually be forthcoming with information, or they may not just be aware of how they're behaving, it's great that we can go in and we can observe, and we can kind of still pull out that really kind of nice information that's really, really useful for understanding like what makes people tick and how behaviors work. And essentially we then take these insights forward into the next stage of research, but I'll just give you a little example here. So same example with the chatbot. I've gone out and I've done my research. I've asked users, you know, what the reasons are that they are finding that they are not able to use the chatbot, what the barriers are to using the chatbot for them. And so here are some examples. So I've mentioned this one already, but it might be quicker in theory to use the chatbot. But if I don't get the answer I need and I have to call anyway, it will end up taking much longer. So again, that's reflective motivation. Another example could be I only ever go to call them from my phone and chatbot never comes up on my mobile. So that's the kind of physical opportunity provided by the service. And actually, I guess importantly, so these are just a couple of examples that I've come up with, but actually, you know, the chances are that your research to understand your users' ability blockers have produced a huge extensive list of problems. So depending on how complex the behaviour was, it's not unusual to have 5, 10 or even more behavioural blockers that are preventing the target behaviour. And actually, in all probability, you won't be able to address all of them, probably just a few of them. So at this point, you might be thinking about, you know, prioritization and what things are going to be the really key ones to carry forward. Okay, so you figured out what's stopping people from performing the target behaviour or behaviours. That's brilliant. But actually what you need to do now is think about how you're going to design something into your product or design a product which will help them overcome these ability blockers. So back to the behaviour change wheel. So the behaviour change wheel offers 9 categories of solutions, otherwise known as intervention functions. And these are interventions to overcome barriers to performing a target behaviour. So I won't go through the whole list of them, but just a couple of examples. So an intervention function could be education, so providing knowledge or understanding where there's a bit of a gap. Incentivization, so creating the expectation of a reward. So for example, giving people points for completing exercises. Or training, so developing skills through instructional practice to help people to change their behaviour. And so just to be clear, so these are kind of intervention functions. These are the kind of categories of the categories of intervention functions that we will start designing within. So these give us a kind of category, if you like, that will be most useful depending on the ability blockers that we've identified. And this is a much easier way, I suppose, of visualizing that. So rather than the wheel doesn't really tell you what. Sorry, I've got some musicians next door that have decided to start playing drums or something. Yeah, so this is a much better way of kind of visualizing how those kind of components that we identified relate to the intervention functions that are going to be relevant to us. So as you can see in this example, if I think that reflective motivation represents, that's really loud. Oh, it stopped. Okay, yeah, so it might be quicker in theory to use the chatbot, but if I don't get the answer I need, I'll have to call the call center anyway. So reflective motivation. So we can look on this table and we can see that for reflective motivation, there are 4 types of intervention functions that are recommended. And this is where we can kind of use our brains a bit really and start thinking about, okay, so these are the options for intervention functions. These are the things that, you know, for this category of problem target behavior, we can see that, yeah, these different things work. But actually for us and for our problem, which of these recommended intervention functions is most likely to I guess, kind of end up in the most kind of effective solution, if you like what's most relevant to our individual problem. Okay, and so this is a slightly more kind of granular, again, a tool. So this is the a taxonomy, which actually helps you to essentially go down like another level again. So you've got your intervention function kind of category, and this tool helps you to then narrow that down even further to more specific behavior intervention techniques within that intervention function. So I should say that this is one approach at this stage, which I think is particularly useful, but there are actually other approaches that you can take. So it's probably worth just, if you are doing some behaviour change design, you can go and explore that a little bit more. And I haven't touched on the alternatives today, but I'm happy if you want to just drop me an email and get in touch. I'm happy to kind of share that kind of information with you. Okay, so customers with simple to solve problems are not using the new chatbot, they're still calling the call center. So again, so this is just the those kind of behavior change techniques at a granular level. That's just those pulled out, ready to carry forward to the next stage. They never ever play music this loudly. I'm not sure why they've chosen this time of today, whilst I'm trying to run through a presentation, to play loud music, but okay. Okay, so the next phase, ideation, design, and test. So we're all really familiar with this. So we need to make sure that the solution is solving the problem that we have identified. So really key things at this stage. So who's going to be involved in designing that solution? That's something that's really important to kind of figure out early. Playing back the research findings is really important. So let's make sure the solution that we're designing definitely, it is actually derived from and it's related to directly the research findings about the target behavior that we need to change. High-level personas sometimes are quite useful tools to help kind of think about solutions. So then coming up with potential solutions. So what might work, what might these solutions look like, and carrying those forward into, again, prioritization. So which of the ideas is likely to have the best success to change behavior? And then, of course, designing it up. So fleshing out the idea, refining it, and working out the details. And then, of course, testing with users. Okay, so consider ethics. So when you're designing your intervention, you should be really mindful of ethical considerations. So for me, with psychology training, I have had ethical conduct absolutely drilled into me from the very beginning of when I started any of my studies. So I think actually for me, I'm considering ethics as early as when I see a brief. Like, it's just ridiculous, but it's really important. And so what I won't go into today is a particular high-profile case, which has just been the focus of a certain documentary, because that's a whole other conversation in itself. But on a kind of similar note, even though behaviour science offers us some kind of tools, depending on who's using them, to get people to do things, or to try to get people to do things they don't want to. So think dark patterns and manipulative design choices. As I mentioned before, behaviour change interventions are most effective when all parties have a goal or something to gain. So it's actually really difficult to get somebody to do something they don't want to, especially in a long-lasting way. And actually trying to force change can make people feel kind of taken advantage of and really frustrated. And essentially that backfires in the long run. And how do you know if your product might have an unintended harmful effect? Well, you might not know, but you could certainly consider the possibilities during the kind of design phase. And, I guess just think about what kind of possibilities might happen. You could almost do a sort of risk assessment and just kind of, have a bit of a brainstorm and kind of think about what those might be. And then you can try to, factor that consideration in when you're, when you're designing. Or potentially be prepared to pull the plug and try something new if adverse effects emerge. Okay, so how will we measure success? So this is something that we're really keen on in UX. So that's usually, looking at our data and just seeing, checking how successful something was. So how we measure success, so really important in behaviour change, take baseline measurements. So we do this anyway, so in UX, so we record any kind of, baseline kind of any usage, for example, chatbot usage in this example, call center data. We get a really good idea of the kind of current state of everything, and we can use kind of data and statistics to establish that. That's our kind of baseline. Measuring exposure metrics, participation and engagement. So we can just kind of like use analytics, for example, to see how people are interacting with those kind of touch points of the intervention. Measuring the behaviour changes. So for example, with current kind of chatbot use, we can kind of constantly monitor that. We can actually ask people to complete surveys once they've used the chatbot. We can ask people why they might not want to use the chatbot, despite the fact we haven't had an intervention built in. So yeah, just lots of different ways to monitor those behaviour changes. We could be quite creative with those. Okay, and long-term outcomes. So kind of similarly again, so it's almost referring back to the kind of baseline measure that we took, and almost just measuring the change from baseline to where we stand today. And we can measure that in an ongoing way. And actually, we can work in a way which means that we can, when we see that something could potentially be improved, or maybe the effects of something is kind of wearing off, or other things in the world have changed and we need to adapt a little bit, we can then go in and we can almost just kind of map that process throughout after we've made those changes or further interventions. Cool. So that's pretty much it, the kind of whiz through 101 behaviour change design and UX. There's a couple of books that I would definitely recommend that are essentials if you want to start thinking a little bit more about this yourself. So Engage by Amy Bucher, absolutely brilliant, as I said before. And The Behaviour Change Wheel is a book by the UCL Lab, who actually designed the wheel, and they've got loads of great publications that you can go and read as well to understand a bit more about how it works. Cool, so thanks for listening.
Cool, thank you so much. That was awesome. Yeah, it was super interesting. I mean, we've got time for a couple of questions. I mean, when you spoke about behaviour change interventions, whereabouts in the process of the user journey would you put the intervention?
The process of the user journey. Okay, so it kind of depends. What the behavior is and what the intervention is. So sometimes the process is the intervention, and actually, and sometimes, yeah, so it completely depends on the service or the product. But actually, so this is the kind of thing that our discovery research would uncover. So when we're trying to find out about those behavioural kind of ability barriers, when we're going out and doing our user research and we're talking to people and we're doing interviews or we're doing observational research, we're going to be recording or understanding at what points the behavioural kind of blockers occur. So for example, with the chatbot example, it might be the case that people might get as far as seeing the chatbot pop up, and it might be at that point they make that kind of decision. They're weighing up the pros and the cons. So that might be the point where we implement the intervention. Or maybe it's much earlier on. So maybe people are thinking, actually, I know there's a chatbot, but I'm actually not necessarily going to use it because I don't think it's right for me. So actually, it might be that we have another pop-up or some other information somewhere in the journey, which kind of sets up the intervention, which that is the intervention, which kind of sets up the kind of process to getting people to change their behavior. So yeah, it can either be the process, the intervention could be the process, or our research will help us to identify at what point in a user journey the intervention needs to be implemented to be successful.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a question from Eden. Are there any other books you recommend reading or courses you recommend taking to enrich our psychology knowledge and apply it to UX?
Psychology knowledge generally. Oh, there's so much. I mean, in terms of behavior change, so conferences that are great. So there's the Behaviour and Design Conference, which is held every year, the BAD conference, and that's absolutely brilliant. So that was a virtual conference this year, and that's so good. So I definitely recommend keeping an eye out for that and signing up to it. So interesting, and applications everywhere. I think, there's loads. I wouldn't even know where to begin, to be honest. But yeah, conference-wise, that's definitely a good one. The book that I've recommended there is really fantastic, by Amy Booker. It talks about all kinds of like psychological principles, and really just what I've talked about today just absolutely kind of scratches the surface of behavior change design. So so that's definitely my top recommendation. But yeah, if you want to drop me an email, I can probably have a little dig around for you. And if you had some slightly more specific things in mind that you're interested in, I'd be happy to chuck some stuff over.
Awesome, thank you. We've probably got time for another couple of questions. I see there's quite a few, so any ones that don't get answered, please, I'm sure, Rebecca, you'll have to answer them on email, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. Yeah, probably got time for a couple more. So this one from Pete. If someone came to you with their target behaviour poorly defined, how would you work with them to improve the definition before continuing?
So I guess I'm not sure if this is answering the question or if this is too much of an obvious answer, but I suppose the first thing you do is just sit down with them, and you almost you can backtrack. So you can start thinking, okay, so firstly, trying to understand like where they are with that kind of behavior, that definition of the target behavior. So why have they arrived at that place? Why is it poorly defined? Do they understand the problem? Do they understand the context? They probably do, and they haven't quite thought about how they're going to frame that yet. So essentially, I guess I would just sit down with them and talk to them about why it's important, and just think about, we really need to consider, who our users are, what the problem is we're trying to kind of target and to change. And unless we know that information, it's impossible really to shape the next stages of the research. So yeah, I guess just talking to them and helping them to understand, why it's important to be really specific, and you can almost illustrate with examples, what the different kind of directions are and the routes that you will travel in those two different kind of circumstances. I hope that answers the question. I think it might not.
Awesome, thank you. So you mentioned high-level personas. With behaviour change in mind, what do you like to include in your personas?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. It completely depends on what the behavior is, what the service is, what the product is. If it's a kind of a snippet of something, or if the intervention is, the product is the intervention. But yeah, I guess the same things that we would use really in UX. So just, the kind of key behaviors. You can start thinking about behavioral drivers. You can think about context in which people might kind of exist, or where these behaviors might exist, or be enabled, or kind of prevented. But yeah, I guess it completely depends on how complicated the behavior that you're trying to change is as well. But yeah, I think you could just essentially just stick with what we already kind of use in UX, but just maybe focus a little bit more around what we consider to be the behaviors.
Awesome, thank you. I think we've got time for just one more question from Maria. How do you recommend conducting observational research during COVID lockdowns? And is there a research method you still find fruitful at this time?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and that's something we've actually been talking about a lot at Mensa recently. So it's really difficult. It depends on I guess, where the observation is taking place. But actually, place everywhere is kind of, fewer people using services in the same way. But yeah, I guess actually, that's the world maybe for the foreseeable future is changing. So maybe, what we're observing is just, it is the kind of the state of the world as it is. Other things you can do as well are just kind of more like online things. So maybe you could do a bit of more kind of like social listening and things like that, just to try and get a kind of idea of other stuff that's going on in a kind of more virtual space. But yeah, it's a difficult one. And yeah, I guess again, it just depends on if how affected by COVID the service is. So yeah, and also I guess just factoring in like this is now what the world is looking like. So maybe the observations that we make in this context are relevant for the near future, and maybe they will still, uncover lots of really interesting things about how, how people are behaving under the current circumstances, and how the current circumstances have impacted how people behave.
Awesome, thank you. I see there is a few more questions in the chat, but we're not going to be able to get to all of them, I'm afraid. I'm going to have to wrap up, but I'm sure Rebecca, you won't mind answering them if people want to drop Rebecca an email.
Yeah, I'm happy if anybody wants to email me.
Awesome, great. Well, no, thanks for presenting. That was super. Yeah, thanks for everyone for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow with 3 more talks. Yeah, hopefully we'll see you then. Cool, thank you.